Okay, welcome to this video tutorial. This is designed for anybody taking AQA Sociology A-level, and today we are going to be looking at the 20 marker theory-based question. This question appears on paper 3, however it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a theory. It could be a method that comes up, so evaluate quantitative methods. It could be a debate style question, sociology of science, but this video is just to prepare you if a theory comes up. So let's get into it. If you have a look at the slide in front of you, you'll see that the question tends to come up like this. Using material from the item and elsewhere, evaluate, I'll put insert theory here because we don't know which theory is going to come up, to understand society. Now we know, having done this course for 2 years, functionalism could come up, Marxism and neo-Marxism, any of the feminisms or just feminism as a whole, action theory, so more micro level understandings and those sorts of theories, or indeed postmodernism. Now, that would be lovely. However, we know that sometimes the theory isn't always given to us. So have a look at these ones. These are what you hope comes up, where they just simply give you the theory. It's very obvious. Apply material from item C in your knowledge. Evaluate the usefulness of Marxist approaches. You have an item that gives you hints at what Marxism is as a theory, which direction to take the essay. Again, at the bottom, you'll see that it says the usefulness of social action theories, with again a supporting item. But what if the question isn't straightforward and it actually hints at a theory? So, for example, the one that I've extracted from a past paper says evaluate the extent to which today's society can be seen as patriarchal. So that is a hint at feminism. The good news is, of course, you do have a supporting item. And the item basically tells you what theory to talk about. Feminists argue that society continues to be patriarchal. Here are some other versions and takes on that hint style question. So it could be apply material from the item in your knowledge, evaluate conflict approaches, evaluate consensus approaches, maybe even evaluate structural approaches. So make sure you know the style of theory that you're revising. Conflict approaches, of course, are your feminisms and Marxism, neo-Marxism. Consensus is much more to do with functionalist ideas. Structural theories could encompass functionalism, Marxism, and indeed feminism. So the next thing that you'd probably want to know is, how do I attack this question? So here is a potential essay plan. There are tons on the internet. This is just my interpretation of how I personally would attack this question, having taught for 18 years, but also having marked the question. So what I tend to do is say to myself, what do the top band answers do with this sort of style question? And here is the answer. Introductions tend to be short and brief. They tend to start by whatever theory comes up, telling the examiner what kind of theory it is. For example, if functionalism came up, in the introduction they would briefly say that it's a macro structural consensus approach. So those introductions need to be nice and short and brief. Then what top band answers tend to do is take 3 or 4 key unique ideas from that theory that helps explain society, and they take the examiner through each of these one by one, designating a paragraph each for each idea and linking it to the other parts of the courses to help build up that picture of how we understand society through that theory. So, for example, if functionalism came up, here are suggestions of 4 potentially unique areas of that theory that you might want to explain. Turn those into Peely paragraphs, and try to link them to education, family, crime, beliefs and methods wherever possible. You cannot possibly link them to every part of the course, so aim for 1 or 2 per paragraph. And then you have a very, very brief conclusion. So a conclusion should summarise very briefly and pick either an overarching opinion that yes, it is a helpful theory for understanding society, or no, it's not. I tend to always bring in postmodernism in a conclusion and say that we can't just look at one theory to understand society. We need to look at a mixture, so consensus and conflict, or structural and action approaches. But of course, if you use postmodernism in the conclusion, you must have used it throughout the essay. No new information in the conclusion. So what I've done here is simply put together a very brief summary of some of the key ideas that functions look at, for instance, in education, religion, crime, families, and research methods. And you can use this if you screenshot it as a kind of a revision test to see if you can remember the summaries, sort of the ideas that they talk about. I've included real life examples because as an examiner, we hardly ever see that. We see people describing theories, but not really applying it to real life examples. Criticisms, try to be explicit, because if you're not explicit and you are very general or provide juxtaposition criticisms, you're not going to get into the top band. And of course, we need to back up what we say with thinkers. So this was just designed to give you a quick summary of functionalism. Okay, what I thought I would do next is show you a model paragraph, what a paragraph would look like if functionalism, for instance, came up as evaluate functionalist ideas for understanding society. Now, you're probably thinking, what is Tesco logo doing at the bottom? That will become apparent in just a second. So let's reveal the paragraph itself. Okay, so I've followed the point, explain, evidence, link, and explicit structure. And you'll see on the right hand side, I've tried to annotate what I, as an examiner, would be impressed with. You'll see that there's lots of colour on this slide, and that is to tell you where I've used or gone shopping in Tesco. So top band paragraphs tend to have these skills on show. They have a theoretical link, explicit evaluation, studies, concepts, and real life or obvious examples to back up what they're saying. So I always teach my students to go shopping in Tesco, down every aisle in Tesco, and use that in your paragraph. So let's have a look and analyse why this is a top band paragraph. So it says functionalists argue that in order for society to exist and function harmoniously, it has needs, what functionalists call functional prerequisites. These needs are met by institutions. So this is starting off pointing out a key idea from functionalists. You know, an idea that is not necessarily given by any other theory. So it's really important that you include this in an essay because it's key to understanding how society works and functions. So in that short couple of sentences, you're picking up or giving the impression of knowledge there, AO1. Now I need to explain it with a chain of reasoning that is deep, is got breadth and depth to it. I need to explain it by defining what functional prerequisites are, what are these needs, who said it, and examples to show that I actually understand what this means. So here I've explained the concept of functional prerequisites, but I've given examples of institutions that meet the needs that society has. So there are 4 main functional prerequisites according to Parsons. They are adaptation. Society needs an economy to enable its members to adapt the environment to provide food and shelter. Latency, institutions like the family that socialise members into shared values to enable a collective conscience. Integration, institutions like the criminal justice system that provide cohesion and resolve conflict. And lastly, goal attainment, institutions like education, the government, that set goals for its members to achieve in order to motivate people and help society progress. If society has these met, we will have stability and social order. So I've explained functional prerequisites and how it's important. Now I've got to back it up by bringing in some examples of how it helps us understand in real time society. So I've put, we can apply this to Durkheim's ideas on crime. Crime satisfies many of these functional prerequisites, but mainly by having the criminal justice system, it allows society to punish, resolve conflict, and provide a safe environment. In this way, crime is actually healthy, a limited amount. So I've backed up with a study of Durkheim to show how crime meets that need. Again, I'm still focused on explaining how functionalists understand how society works by looking at its needs. Here I'm going to back it up with some examples. For example, when horrific crimes like the murder of Deborah Cox and Sarah Everard, the public join together. There's often a public vigil and a well-documented trial. This demonstrates that from a functionist perspective, society's members are brought together in joint grief. Boundaries are reaffirmed by showing punishments like long-term prison sentences for offenders, and it resolves any potential conflicts that could arise if offenders were not dealt with seriously. Therefore, functionists understand that society has needs that must be met by institutions to ensure social order. So I link back to the question to make sure I'm focused still on the point that I was originally trying to make before I start my evaluation. The evaluation has to be explicit, so I can't just say Marxists would disagree. I have to say what it is about what I've just said that Marxists would disagree with. So I've given the example of Gordon, who sees crime as exposing social divisions rather than unifying communities, as seen in the events like 2011 UK riots. So overall, I've got a point, I've explained it with evidence, and I've linked back to the question, and I've got explicit evaluation. We'll check our Tesco shopping. There's theory, functionalism, there is Marxism as a theory as well. I've got explicit evaluation. I'm talking about inequality and conflict arising from crime rather than a functional purpose of it. I've got studies from Durkheim. I've got studies from Gordon. I've got concepts, functional prerequisites. I've named them. I've got lots of language linked to functionalism in there. And I've got lots and lots of obvious examples to build up my point. Now on to another theory. So that's functionalism, but what happens if action theory comes up? And you would have learnt social action, symbolic interactionism, F methodology, and phenomenology. So what I've done here is just giving you a very short summary of what they say about education, families, crime, religion, and methods, some key thinkers, a summary of their ideas, and real life examples again with some criticisms at the end. So feel free to use that as just a very brief kind of summary of their ideas when you are revising. If we look specifically at symbolic interactionist, that's the biggest, chunkiest action theory that you probably studied. I've broken it down into a little bit more detail because in the past we have seen a question where it is just focused on symbolic interactionism rather than all of the action theories. Okay, here is another example of a model paragraph. This time we're looking at action theory. Again, you can use this, you can screenshot it. I've gone shopping in Tesco again. I've got theoretical links. I've got evaluation that's explicit. I've got at least 2 studies, lots and lots of concepts, so it's conceptually detailed, and obvious examples to back up what I'm saying. So you can see I've started off by pointing out a key feature that puts symbolic interactionism apart from other types of theories, and that is this idea that they use with agency, this concept of social agency. So it's very unlike any structural theory, for instance. It's a very kind of micro way of analysing society. So I've put action theories like symbolic interactionism are used for understanding society because they focus on individual agency and the meanings people attach to their actions, showing that social life is actively constructed rather than simply determined by structures. Now, what I like about that is also the comparison to structural theories. There's a lot of analysis in there already. So I've got to explain what I mean by this. So unlike structural theories like Marxism, functionalism, action theory argues that society exists through everyday interactions. People negotiate roles, norms, identities. This approach highlights that individuals are not passive actors, but actively interpret and respond to social expectations. So again, comparisons with the other ways of understanding society, trying to reinforce this idea that this theory is different because we're looking at negotiations, how people interact, as opposed to assuming we are all passive puppets to the institutions. Now I've got to bring in some classic studies to back up my knowledge on this and my point. So I've got Becker's labelling theory, perfect at explaining how teachers' expectations can create self-fulfilling prophecies in schools, where students labelled as troublemakers were more likely to underachieve, illustrating the micro-level impact of the interactions. Goffman in asylums demonstrated how institutionalization shapes your identity, again through daily interactions, showing that roles and deviance are constructed through experience, they're not predetermined, reinforcing that idea, of course, of agency. Real-life examples include how social media influences personal identity, as users present curated selves based on audience feedback, highlighting ongoing negotiation of meaning. So what I mean by that is we're trying to prove that people are not passive puppets. We are trying to say that if you want to understand society, you must understand that people create their own identities, they negotiate, they can change their identity, and social media is a powerful way that this really highlights us doing this, because people present a certain self that they think is what people want to see based on audience feedback. That's proof that we take on board the role of the other, we take on this kind of looking glass self almost and try to present ourselves in a certain light. We would not do that if we were passive puppets. So I've made links here then to education and to an extent deviance with asylums and Goffin there. The last thing I do is make sure that I've linked it back. So I've put, however, while action theory offers rich insights into individual experiences, they are limited in explaining broader patterns and structural inequalities. So I go straight into an explicit evaluation. So I've given examples of inequalities that seem to be a pattern, a trend. So I've put systematic poverty, class oppression, which are crucial to understanding society as a whole. Therefore, action theories are most effective when combined with structural approaches, giving a fuller picture of both micro-level meanings and macro-level constraints. So overall, my key point that I wanted to make was people have agency. I've demonstrated it with self-fulfilling prophecy. I've demonstrated it through construction of identity using Goffman, and a modern day example of social media and how we create ourselves based on audience feedback before evaluating. We've done a Tesco check. You can see all of the highlighted areas suggesting where I've mentioned theory, evaluation, studies, concepts, and obvious examples. So again, this is a model kind of paragraph that you might use. If Marxism comes up, I've included a very quick summary again of their key ideas on all of the topics that you would have studied over the 2 years, real life examples, criticisms and key thinkers again. So you can stop the video here and take a screenshot if that would help. And again, we've got a model paragraph. So this time I haven't highlighted it because I thought maybe you'd want to print this screenshot and have a go at highlighting the Tesco yourself. But again, we've followed the same paragraph structure, point, explain with examples and link evaluation. So this is an example model paragraph if Marxism came up. So I start off by highlighting a key feature exclusive to Marxism, which is the infrastructure and superstructure model. That is a key idea. It gets me a recognition of knowledge for this, AO1. So I've put Marxist theory is useful for understanding society because it explores how the economic base shapes the superstructure, including institutions like religion and education. I've got to explain what I mean by this. So I've already highlighted the theory. I've already got the concept of base and infrastructure, superstructure, institutions, obvious examples of religion and education, all in that first part. If we look at the explanation then, I explain and define the model and introduce the institutions a bit more thoroughly and by principles of this model. So the infrastructure refers to the means of production and economic relations, while the superstructure consists of institutions like culture and ideology that maintain and justify the economic system. If we look at religion and education, they're part of the superstructure. They reflect the interests of the ruling class and help reproduce the economic base by shaping our beliefs, values, behaviours in ways that support capitalism. So lots of concepts in that second part of my paragraph. Now I've got to bring in an example of a study who said this. So an example of this is Althusser, who argued that religion is part of the superstructure. It functions as an ideological state apparatus to maintain ruling class dominance. Back it up with an example. How does religion actually do that? How does religion control our ideas to maintain and keep the ruling class on the top? So I'll put historically churches legitimated monarchies through the divine right of kings, presenting hierarchy as God's will. We can look at education as well. We don't have to just stick with religion here. I've put education reproduces class inequality through the hidden curriculum. So Bowles and Gintis looked at the hidden curriculum, if you remember. Teaching obedience, preparing students for roles in the capitalist workforce, sustaining the economic base. Both institutions illustrate how the superstructure is shaped by and serves to maintain the infrastructure. So again, here you can see I've got Althusser and Bowles and Gintis as my studies, lots of concepts in green, and I've tried to give an actual real life example from religion, how it maintains capitalism basically. And I've also got links to education. My evaluation has to be explicit. So I've said critics argue that the model is deterministic. Don't stop there. Why is it deterministic? It underestimates human agency in the ways institutions can challenge the economic system. For example, education can promote critical thinking and social mobility, so it can change the hierarchy. And religious movements like the liberation theology sometimes opposes the economic oppression. So obviously when you looked at religion, you may have come across liberation theology, looking at how the Catholic churches tried to go against the dominant sort of ideology at that time in South America. They used religion to kind of go against the dominant ruling class there. So while the infrastructure superstructure model is useful for showing how the economic structures influence society, it cannot fully explain the potential for resistance or change. And that is your overall paragraph done. So we've got point, explain, examples, and again, a link and evaluation. You can see that the Tesco's been highlighted now. So you can see the evaluation is explicit. You've got liberation theology as your second theory mentioned. And again, lots of concepts and obvious examples. So again, I've done a quick revision for radical feminism. So you can pause the video here and have a look if you want to screenshot it. And I've done the same with Marxism, liberal and difference feminism. Again, certainly not enough to revise from, but a good quick summative revision tool potentially for you guys to use at home. And we're going to finish with a model paragraph for radical feminists. So again, take a key idea from radical feminists. And I'm going to go with patriarchy because they are the ones that would say all of society is dominated and characterized by patriarchy. And I'm going to explain it with some evidence from education. So radical feminists argue every institution in society reproduces and maintains patriarchy. They understand how society is maintaining gender inequality in this way. So the second part explains the concept of patriarchy through the example of education and socialising students into gender roles. So they argue education is a central institution through which patriarchy is reproduced and maintained. They see schools as places that socialise boys and girls into traditional gender roles, ensuring that men remain dominant in both the labour market and family. By funneling girls into certain feminised roles, education helps maintain women's subordination across generations. The example I've used is Sharp's study, how Sharp said that girls in the 70s prioritised marriage over and family over careers, and later showed that this was changing. However, Wiener argued that stereotypes about women's roles still persist in schools. So despite Sharp's findings, if you like, of a change in attitude, we still see a clear difference in STEM subjects and who takes up STEM subjects. So even if girls are prioritising careers over families and marriage, it's still heavily based on gender roles. And then I've got a link back to the original idea of patriarchy to keep the paragraph focused. So demonstrates how education This demonstrates how education operates as a key mechanism of patriarchy, ensuring that gender inequality continues to shape wider society. And then I finish with an evaluation that is explicit. It's overly deterministic, but why? Liberal feminists point out that significant progress has been made in challenging stereotypes. So I've brought in some examples of policies that have really tried to attack that STEM pattern, so gist and wise. They suggest that while radical feminists correctly highlight patriarchy and how it's reproduced, they underestimate the ways education can promote equality and empower women. So much more of a positive, kind of less skeptical feminist approach there. The last thing I'm going to do is just show you a few slides where I've summarised postmodernism. So this is education. So it's a brief summary of postmodernist ideas on education, some key studies, real life examples and criticisms. This is the one for families, beliefs, crime and methodological kind of summary as well. Now, I hope you found that interesting. I hope that the model paragraphs demonstrate clearly the skills that tend to appear on the top band kind of criteria. And watch out for some more videos where I will go through the debates and I will go through a method style question too. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like.